So I'm speaking to you about a project that I'm doing. Another person, Robin Warhol, but that's in more in a minute. And it's on a Victorian figure, George Scharf. If you haven't heard of George Scharf, it's not because you're ignorant, because no one has. It's also not even because this is an interdisciplinary event or speaking over disciplinary gaps. No one in my discipline, or even in the discipline of museum history, because the founding director of the National Portrait Gallery remembers today. And even if you think you know who he is, if you think you know George Sharp, then you really know his father. So don't worry about it. Let me tell you. The other caveat is that these people started out being very much, and the project in general started out being very much about discipline and about the role of specifically literary role, scholars, and the role of novel readers in the archive. And I know that this is a panel on discipline, but since I tweaked it to be about ephemera, I'm being a little discipline that kind of has disciplinary material not vanish, but only the archival space. So that if you have questions about that, we can talk about it during the Q&A. I'm speaking to you from somewhere near the end of a 10-year-long archival journey that I've been fortunate enough to take with my friend and colleague, Robin Warhol. That journey began, as do many archival stories, with a moment of rejection, failure, and humiliation, a surfacing of the power of the institutional archive. Robin, hoping to look in the British Library at the original parts issue of late Dickens novels and at the advertisements included at the end of every part, was told that she could not, despite her many letters of introduction, have access to the material. What followed is something that Robin and I have learned to recognize in ourselves and others as archival sulking. These affectively charged moments when a project in an archive has been, for whatever reason, foreclosed, that lead not to exiting the archive and shaking its dust from our feet, but to looking elsewhere within it. And elsewhere in this instance was the newly digitalized catalog of Ephemera, an entry for what was called in that catalog an album of dinner menus and invitations from the 1870s through the 1890s. Because Robin and I had often thought of doing a foodways project together, both because we love food and would have liked at some point to be able to use the foodways in a sentence, an ambition, by the way, that's been realized as of this moment, Robin put in a request for the album and lugged it to a reading stand so she could take a closer look. I say she to mark the last moment for all our subsequent friendly disagreements with regard to what became a book about George Scharf, that we thought of the project as belonging to only one of us. It's true that, despite the album's size and weight, we were each individually capable of lifting it, but it was the kind of ungainly object that works much better if two people take responsibility for it, making sure nothing falls out. Over the many revisitations of the album, at least when both of us were in the British Library together, one of us would carry the thing and the other would follow behind in a sort of ceremonial progress until it came to rest upon a reading desk. That album, really an oversized scrapbook, set in motion 10 years of visits and revisitations, the success and failure of irresponsible hypotheses, the activation of shared and sometimes competing archival desires, and a startling but tantalizingly incomplete intimacy with the man who pasted those cards, those invitations, and those menus onto the album's pages, George Scharf Jr., later, in the last months of his life, Sir George Scharf. But in invoking Scharf's name, I anticipate my story, imposing an archival teleology on what started as a love affair with an object and the objects it contained, a love affair, indeed, with cardboard. That's one page of the album, and if you see the crosses, those can be folded up into horrible little boxes. They are menus from Although the invitations and calling cards were interesting, it was the menus that got to us. Beautifully decorated cards listing multiple artery-hardening courses in good French, bad French, and in English. They whetted our appetites not just for turtle soup, poulet meringue aux crevisses, and less exalted comfort food like raspberry tea sandwiches, but also more generally for things Victorian, for Victorian things. We're embarrassed to think how long we played with the album, folding and unfolding the toile and gilt box menus from Knoll, the enormous and enormously famous country house of the Sackville West family, before we thought to ask who it was behind this collection. Our fascination and our lingering, we think, complexly intertwined with the album's equivocal status as ephemera and with the process of self-archiving that had preserved, without context, what might so easily have been thrown away. The scrapbook itself, the spine and pages that made an archive within an archive, was actually more fragile than the thicker cardboard items it contained and made meaningful. And I know we've been talking about scrapbooks, and so it's actually it's actually this material which is crumbling, and so the very object that is preserving the other objects is what's going first. It was precisely the fragility of the scrapbook, the ever-present threat, or was it a promise, of its falling into pieces that made us feel, however naively, that we had in front of us a real thing, or more tantalizingly, a set of real things that activated what Elaine Friedgood has called strong metonymy, the power of an object to suggest and indeed to index reality, and in this case, both a period, Victorian, and a person, George Scharf. What emerged from our engagement with the ephemeral archive was an identification of George Scharf as primarily and definitionally a dinner guest. Out of the hundreds of menus from historical houses like Knoll and Blenheim Castle, menus and seating charts from seafood restaurants in Richmond for the annual dinners of groups of which Scharf was a member, from the Antiquarian Society to the liberal and conservative clubs to the worshipful company of brewers, only one came from a relatively modest dinner George himself had hosted. This was, in our view, an album of someone who defined himself by dining out and as a guest, a snob or a B-list celebrity who, in the strangely precise parlance of Victorian class, lived off dinners. We all live off dinners, but by the time we returned to the album for the first time, we knew that George, as we fondly came to call him, was many other things as well. This is the official George, his size and scale, his massive, obese, somewhat reduced by the official portrait. We knew that he was the founding director of the National Portrait Gallery in London, that he was the draftsman who accompanied Charles Fellows to Anatolia on his controversial project to transport the Xanthus marbles to the British Museum, and most importantly, in terms of the album, that he became in midlife an authenticator and cataloger of portrait collections of the rich and titled. It was in this role as cataloger that he spent many weeks each year at great country houses whose dinner menus he saved and pasted into the album. But we knew him most intimately as a guest, the evidence of his eating Parmesan tuiles at Knoll or duckling at Chevening spread before us like a banquet. In our subsequent project to write a life, or what we're actually calling a vita of George Scharf, it was this identity that persisted. It was the after images of these menus that shaped the project. As the project developed into an attempt at life writing at odds with the conventions of biography, we decided to propose an identity that defined George Scharf not as biographical subjects usually are, by profession, marital status, or accomplishments, but by certain definitional acts related in complex ways to other possible identities of eating rich food at rich houses, not his own. We chose dinner guest for this identity and for the working title of the project. In so choosing, we hope to avoid the essentializing or freezing of Scharf into conventional identificatory categories. We hoped that Dinner Guest would enable us to see more clearly his complicated relation to his employers and to his peers, and to allow us to say something new about Victorian profession and class. Finally, we hoped that Dinner Guest would allow us to talk about George's increasingly large body in a way that was both attentive to pleasure and not easily absorbed by canonical categories of sexual identity. We still have that ambition, but the terms in which the ambition was articulated changed over the years as we came partly out of the spell of those pieces of cardboard and took ourselves across London to the official archives of the National Portrait Gallery. Remember, he was the founding director. We carried the idea of George Scharf Dinner Guest out of the ephemeral and into the institutional archive, from an archival experience defined by cardboard to one defined by the Scharf papers, with a capital P, preserved in the Portrait Gallery Heinz archive. Ironically, the move from cardboard to paper was also a move away from the contingent and the ephemeral, what was that album doing in the British Library anyway, to the official. Scharf's papers are crucial to the originary narrative of the National Portrait Gallery. They are made up of many items, most of them, but not all of them, made out of paper. And there's also now a digital archive that actually was developed over the course of our doing the project. That archive contained many things: correspondence with trustees of the gallery, a set of professional diaries with lists of portraits acquired and important visitors to the National Portrait Gallery, private correspondence with friends, Scharf's aunt's diary, his father's diary, endless sketchbooks, his mother's diary, a camera lucida, and most interesting to us, a set of his personal diaries meticulously kept for 40 years. Despite our knowledge from past experience, mine in particular, since I'd really recently completed a project on honeymoon diaries, the diaries do not necessarily tell you the intimate details that are the subject of archival desires and fantasies. We were excited to move from things to what we imagined might be something like Scharfian interiority. We saw the diaries and we thought, okay, there he is. When we first saw the personal diaries at the NPG, when the archivists had turned call slips into things, those things seemed at first perfectly to embody what we have called the romance of the archive. First, they came, as all archival objects should, in boxes. These were not the satisfying, but ultimately run-of-the-mill boxes, acid-free, provided by 21st century libraries and archives, but real Victorian boxes. One for each year, each containing 12 miniature books, one for each month of the 50 years between 1845 and 1895. Like the scrapbook, these boxes were interactive. While there was no folding or unfolding here, the archivists were watching, there was the joy of taking out an individual palm-sized book and slipping, say, November 1856, back where it belonged between October and December. So here's the box, an example of a yearly box, and inside the yearly box are monthly diaries, and inside the monthly diaries are very full and startlingly legible entries. So lots of archival promise, lots of archival romance. We thought we held in our hands order, precision, and a compelling mix of transparency and secrecy. We thought we had plot in the meticulous progression of time, and character in the precise and mostly legible handwriting that looked first to appear on every page. Together, the 50 boxes, the 600 individual booklets look like they might add up to a life, or even a life with a capital L. In this, at least at first, we were cruelly disappointed. The personal diaries consisted of notes about the weather, lists of daily expenses for shoelaces, drawing material, and Devonshire cream, and lists of people whom George had met on a particular day, or not so much met actually, but had lunch or dinner with. Dull day, a frequent comment about the English weather, became our refrain as we read through the pages of the diary. Although there were exceptions to the tedium of the diaries, most particularly moving entries about the death of his mother and of his friend and patron, Lord Stanhope, Our desire for plot and interiority, attributable in part to the disciplinary expectations of two scholars of the Victorian novel, was blocked by the genre of the diary. For some reason, however, we persisted in our reading of the years of entries by the man we came to call the most boring man in the world. And slowly, over repeated visits, we found ways of working with the grain of the diary, with their initially off-putting temporalities of recursion and reminder, their name-dropping, and their anxious accounting. I hope you can see the anxious accounting. Can you see the anxious accounting? Okay. Our first attempts at making plot and meaning came directly from our experience with the album. We looked in the 40 years of diaries for George's visits to great houses, whose names usefully appeared at the top of every daily entry during a given visit. Slowly, we began to put together a story of George's visit to some of these houses, and to Noel in particular. We watched as his relation to his patrons changed from employee to something like a friend in the late Victorian sense, and identified conflicting signals about class. We read his year-end summaries, penned usually on December 31st or January 1st of a given year, that marked and celebrated professional progress through a growing list of titled acquaintances and also jobs. The year-end summary for 1862, inserted with engaging snobbishness at the end of a diary on a piece of stationery from Blenheim Castle, where he was staying with the Duke of Marlborough, is typical of the early retrospective entries. We're going to actually see this twice. It is very gratifying to find all my views well understood and my pursuits so thoroughly supported by Lord Stanhope, the Duke of Marlborough, and Lord Derby. Charles Lewis is chief among my younger friends. Mr. Crabbe Robinson and Miss Bailey are my best and steadiest old friends. Wigman and Lawrence are the firmest of my own standing. Pattison is younger in years, but my equal in cordial spirits. The year is out. As I wrote Pattison, the clock struck 12, and I therefore close 1862. May 1863 prove a worthy successor, and may God direct my ways to do always that which is righteous in his sight. Amen. After reading with the grain of the diaries, with the list of titles acquaintances, the mentions of trips to Noel and other houses, and the listing of portraits he found there, we felt we'd made significant progress in thinking about the identity of dinner guest. Because we were interested in George's role as guest, as we had produced it from the ephemeral archive, we were for several years, we're a little slow, blind to another identity very much visible in the diaries, but not, of course, in the album, his role as host. If you remember, the ephemeral archive did contain one piece of cardboard expressive of George as host, the menu for his dinner party on December 22nd, 1877. We had taken its singular presence as roughly indicative of the proportion of hosting to visiting in George's life. A closer look at the dessert course on the menu shows why it might have been included. George has crossed out lemon and substituted wine jelly as the final item on the dinner. Obviously, he's made a mistake or changed his mind and cannot use the menu as part of his table setting. Thus, ironically, the discarded menu has become the only item to be preserved for posterity. It is both the most ephemeral of what further research suggested must have been many hundreds of such pieces of ephemera, and the only one that made it into the ephemeral archive. The defaced piece of cardboard can be read as a metonym for other prettier versions for this dinner and for others that signal another identity for George, not as a guest at country houses, but as a host of intimate dinners. And if you read the diaries, there are many examples of such dinners, especially after 1858, when George moved into his own rooms at the National Portrait Gallery. They increase in frequency again when he moves to lodgings in 8 Ashley Place in 1871. There are literally hundreds of small, always all-male dinners that sometimes appear in the diaries as grocery lists or as carefully drawn seating charts. It was these all-male dinners that led us to think about the status of George's friendship with younger men, and in particular with Jack Pattison, the younger man he mentions as Pattison in the year-end summary we just looked at. If we turn our gaze from Knoll to London, from the album to the diaries, from cardboard to paper, the lords and dukes fade from view to be replaced by a different set of characters. Young men who look up to George, to whom he gave gifts, whom he calls by their last names or by nicknames. The word friend, used in the diary to indicate that complicated mixture of patronage and intimacy, becomes a friend in the emerging modern sense. The year-end summaries read differently if we read past the roll call of the titled to the end of what's essentially a ranked list. And this is a recursive PowerPoint. Whoops. It is very gratifying to find all my views well understood and my pursuits so thoroughly supported by Lord Stanhope, the Duke of Marlborough, and Lord Derby. That's the titled first sentence. And then we begin to see Charles Lewis is chief among my younger friends, and then down to the mention of Jack Pattison. Okay. What appeared to us in a second reading was not the snobbery or professional pride of our first reading, but the warmth of his affection for Jack Pattison. Despite having read Jack's name many times, we were able to see Jack in a new way and to imagine the intimate connection of Jack with the new year as a link between George's past and future. We also came to see the talismanic quality of Jack's name, a quality borne out as we explored further another self-archive, George's preservation of Jack's letter under the title Jacania. This is in George's script, and that's the only such title. George as host and center of what Jack came to call the Ashley Place Circle, the George who's part of a complicated story of same-sex love, concession, and loss. I do want to end by thinking about the relationship between the ephemeral and institutional archive. While I may seem to have presented that relationship as binary and attached to discrete identities, my point is that the relationship is in fact a recursive one. Reading the diaries took us back to the menu for George's intimate dinner. Rereading the menus helped us to think about different kinds of erotics of food and what they might mean for what we usually think of as a larger erotics. The impulse to define George as both guest and host allows us to think alongside of Eve Sedgwick's call for moving beyond the hetero-homo divide, while remaining faithful to what we can understand of George's desire. Our task is at the same time, of course, to understand our own desires for things, for the Victorian, for character, for food, for story, and for the archive that contains them all. Thank you.